just chaired a meeting of the Cabinet where we agreed that the government should call a general election to be held on the 8th of June.
For the people of Britain to stand up against this government and its failed economic agenda, which has left our NHS in problems, which has left our schools underfunded.
I don't think it's undemocratic for us to say the British people should have the final say on that deal. Now, if they like that deal, then yes, we leave on those terms.
This is now a general election. I think that politics is on our table. We're the only party that has campaigned all our political lives to offer real Brexit.
If you feel cheated by the current system, it's time to change the game. Together, we can change the game.
From politics to economy, to business, technology, the totality of what makes man is what we bring to you here on Newspunch. We give you the information that you need, from business to economy, to politics, to technology. And that's all we do here on Newspunch, from the beginning to the end. And that is why we are here. Keep watching.
Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Tunde Labi. It's a pleasure to have you join us on the program. This is Newspunch, coming to you live from our North London studio, where we're broadcasting to our viewers across Europe, the United Kingdom, Africa, and indeed West Africa. This evening we will be talking a bit of some politics, but more specifically we'll be taking a look at how government and governance works, how they impact on your everyday life, and the people who actually make decisions, how some of these decisions are carried out in government and in politics. And we'll talk a bit of some what is going on in the United Kingdom now, which is the general elections campaign, and how is that going to affect you. What are some of the decisions you need to make to have the right choice. My name is Tunde Alabi. I'm joined this evening by Meg Ilia. Meg Ilia is the Labour and co-parliamentary candidate for Acne South and Shoreditch. Meg, thank you for joining us on the program today.
Pleasure, Tunde.
And now we're joined again by Sam Foxman. Sam Foxman is usual analyst on the program. He is of the Developed Africa. Sam, thank you for joining us on the program today.
Thanks for having me, Tunde.
You'll be given the opportunity to call into the studio at the appropriate time and join the discussion as we go on in this program. First, let me start with my special guest on the show, Meg. You are, in the last parliament, you were the chair of the Public Account Committee, and you were also a part of the Speaker's Commission on Digital Democracy. Let's look at those two responsibilities. But first, in your role as the chair of the Public Account Committee, how does that work? What do you do?
Basically, it's the public spending watchdog in Parliament, and we look at how efficiently, effectively and economically government spends your money and my money, our tax money, on government services. And we spend a lot of time as well looking at how well government projects have been delivered, particularly looking at where things have gone wrong in an attempt to draw government's attention to the lessons it needs to learn to spend our money more wisely and deliver effective services for the citizen.
In that role, do you have that oversight responsibility to say, look, enough money is not given to the NHS, why don't you take some of it from the NHS and put it in the policing?
No, actually, the role of the committee is not to discuss whether a policy is the right policy. So we wouldn't say, we wouldn't make a decision about where money is spent, but how it's spent when the government's made the decision. That helps us as a cross-party committee reach a consensus, I think. And I can tell you that whatever party, whether the MP is in government or not, we're all as angry when we see waste and we see citizens suffering because a government policy hasn't worked. And we make some quite hard-hitting reports. And in over 150 years, they have all been agreed consensually. There has never been a minority report, which I think is testament to it. And I've been very pleased to work, actually, with colleagues of all parties who are willing to call out waste where they see it. And I've been leading that team.
Has there been any waste in the government that's just
Oh, I mean, yeah,
your committee notice anyways?
Yes, I mean, one of the challenges, of course, is how the NHS is funded. Demand is going up, the population is getting older, there's new announcements every day on what new drugs and treatments are available, so that increases the pressure on the budget. So the government rightly says it's been putting more cash in, but because demand's going up, it's not actually enough to meet that demand. And similarly, we're seeing that kind of trend in education, where the government says we're putting more cash in, but in real terms, because the number of pupils are going up, it's actually the equivalent to an 8%.
From the angle of your committee, indeed, do you see the government, every time the Prime Minister then talked about our government has put in more money, say for instance in the NHS, you see people say, hang on, we're not seeing this money. Did your committee actually see money going into the NHS?
Well, exactly that. We look very, very closely at the real numbers. So yes, more cash has gone in, but because demand has gone up, that's why people out there are seeing longer queues for GP appointments, longer waits in hospital, ambulances taking longer to get to you. All of those things are because there's too much demand for the money available. So on the one hand, there's a truth. This is why you've got to be very careful about statistics and figures in politics, that money is going in, but is it enough money to meet the needs that we're also promising? So on the one hand, there's a promise about A&E waits, about access to your GP, but if there's not enough money to deliver that, is that enough money to run the health service? And over about 12 reports in the last year alone, we've concluded that there really isn't enough going in, and that some of the sort of simple sentence announcements made by ministers just don't really stack up when under great scrutiny. And as I say, this is a cross-party committee. It's not just me as a Labour candidate saying that.
Sam, when you hear government say, we'll put more money in the NHS, we'll put more money in this, in that, and you see people like you and I will go to use these services to say, it doesn't seem we're seeing anything happening. And then but you've got the chair of the Public Account Committee sitting right here saying, look, money pushing more money, but demand seems to be a little bit on the high side. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, there are two, with the NHS specifically, to look at that one issue, there are a series of quite specific pressures that create increased costs in the NHS over and above the extra amount of money that's been put in. And the two things that leap to mind are the ageing population phenomenon, the phenomenon of the ageing population. So there are more and more increasingly old people, and they have a whole range of different health needs. So as people live longer, their health needs go on longer and become more severe. So that's one side of the reason that the NHS, despite getting more money in real terms, despite getting more money over and above the rate of inflation, the per patient money is effectively going down, or the amount of money that it needs. And the other side of that is that, as I understand it, social care is not considered as part of the NHS budget. There have been not insignificant real terms cuts to the provision of social care. That means that, again, especially elderly people have to spend longer in hospital, which means there's this phenomenon which is, in my view, quite distastefully referred to as bed blocking, but that's the sort of catch-all term for the phenomenon, where because there isn't the space in social care to move people to, there are longer wait times. So partly it's a phenomenon that the NHS simply needs more money. Partly it's a phenomenon that it doesn't necessarily need more money, it needs more time, that it's not being given because of money not spent in other areas.
And we've looked at this a lot across sectors of government. We call it cost shunting, where a department will say, well, we're saving money, so they'll save money in local government. That cut then falls, as Sam said, on, say, social care. And then the cost is shunted to the very expensive end, which is the NHS treatment in hospital, which is an expensive way to treat people. Much, much better if you can, much further down the line, help prevent older people going to hospital. So one of the local hospitals in East London has 2 people on a motorbike that goes round and probably treats about 14 people a day that don't go into A&E. And if you're an older person who falls at home and it can be treated in the home, you never go to hospital at all. Once you're in hospital, then they'll find a lot of other things wrong with you, because actually, if we're all getting older, things don't heal so quickly, and it's just much better if people can stay where they are and get treated in the most appropriate place. But unfortunately, there's a sort of rush, especially if you can't get to your GP, people go to A&E. So you see the whole system clogging up, and that's something we really look at on the Public Accounts Committee and say to government, you've really got to look bigger. And there's a real pressure for politicians, and I'm a politician, you've got a 5-year or so electoral term, we've only had 2 years of this parliament, everyone wants to do things quickly. Actually, you do need to have a long-term plan, and unfortunately we haven't really had that national conversation about the health service. So money is part of it, but it's also how the systems work. So because I don't want our tax money spent, you know, can't keep giving more taxes for everything all the time. We need to make sure it's spent as efficiently as possible, and that's a very big part of our work.
You sit in a parliament, you sit in the Commons, maybe every Wednesday, you hear the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn accusing the Prime Minister, Theresa May, look, you're not funding the NHS. You also sit in the Commons as a chair of the Public Account Committee, and then you hear someone say you're not funding the NHS, and then someone say, look, we're putting money into this thing. What comes to you when you hear that kind of attack on?
Well, I think we've got a very adversarial politics in this country, that you have to have opposite positions. The truth is in between. Yes, more money is going in, but as Sam has highlighted, you know, there's demands that are going up. So what we need, I think, on the NHS and social care, and I've worked with other select committee chairs and MPs of all parties to try and push the current Prime Minister, you know, we don't know who the Prime Minister will be after the election, to look at working with other parties so that you don't just have an approach to the NHS and funding that for 5 years, but that you plan it over 20 years, so that there are things that could be improved and made more efficient. But at the same time, we've also got to have big discussions about what treatment is provided and whether there is, you know, there are some things that we won't offer in future on the NHS. There's some discussions like that beginning to happen, but you need a good political lead to have that discussion seriously with the public. And it may be that we conclude that we continue to offer everything, but that we've got to pay for it a different way. But that's a discussion that's got to be had at top political level. I can do the numbers, but my committee doesn't make the decisions about the policy. But we share concerns with the Conservative MP Sarah Wollaston has chaired the Health Select Committee, and we've been working very closely together to try and call out to government. You can't just keep saying more money's going in, it's all fine. It's not fine. Out there, your viewers will know it's not fine when they're trying to get a GP appointment in the UK, or they're waiting for a colleague or friend or themselves to have an operation. All those delays, people know on the ground it's not working, and we're trying to say to government, you've got to really recognise this and come up with a long-term solution.
Jerome Corbyn has said a couple of times that the NHS is being privatised. How true is that?
Well,
Part of the
successive governments have outsourced certain aspects of the NHS, and but with varying degrees of success. I don't think most people mind if your wheelchair is made by a private company, so you could call that privatisation. But some of the things that haven't, the key thing that for us where the failure happens is where the contract for the service has never drawn up well in the first place. So it's not clear whether it's run by the public sector or the private sector exactly what they were providing. And so we've seen errors both ways. I wouldn't pretend that the public sector always gets it right or the private sector always gets it wrong. And actually, the shifts and changes in the NHS have just made it, disaggregated it, so it's very difficult to follow through who's accountable for decisions and spending money, and that's been quite hard to do. Hospitals are fairly straightforward because there's a hospital building, it's quite physical, you can track the money through. Nearly everything else is much harder to do, and that's the big issue for me when I was chairing the Public Accounts Committee, was to say, well, you know, who is in the end, where does the buck stop? And we would play what we called Public Accounts Committee tennis. So we asked the people in front of us, where does the buck stop? Who's in charge of this if it goes wrong? And they'd look like this at each other, desperate for somebody else to take responsibility. And that's the key issue about the private sector. Whoever's running it, we've got to know who's responsible, and if something goes wrong, they're held to account, and if something goes right, you know, that's fine too, but we need to know who's in charge. And that's the problem, is more the fragmentation of the NHS.
Regardless of how much money the government allocates to whichever sector, does your committee, or did your committee actually have spoken to the government about the data for measuring performance? Is that available? Yeah. Does the government know what particular amount has actually achieved in terms of the allocation?
This is a perennial problem, and it's something that needs to be built in from day one. And when I'm visiting countries that are emerging with their governments, it's something I always say to them. From the beginning, start working out how you will measure the outcomes, not just the outputs, but the actual impact on people, and what measurements you'll use for that. So we are constantly saying there's no information here. So when, for example, the government's looking at removing £3 billion from education in England, so from schools in England, it's saying you can save £1.7 billion by using staff more efficiently. But we said, well, how will you know what the impact is on pupils' learning, on the nature of the curriculum, on the, whether a school can actually continue to function. What are the measures that will tell you when something's going wrong in Whitehall? And they didn't have them, and that's just one of many examples like that. So we're saying to government from the beginning, when you plan a programme, you plan a project, or you plan cuts, you need to be clear how you're going to measure success and whether those measures are really meaningful. So yes, there's financial measures, but for us, and increasingly when I was as chair, I really tried to drive through what is the impact on the citizen. And if you look at schools, it's the impact on the pupil, their learning opportunities, their ambitions, and their pathway into further skills training or higher education. That's what matters most. So how are you measuring that? Not just the money. And that's really, really important. And unfortunately, government's got a patchy record on this. And sometimes once they've committed to a project, they don't want to withdraw from it because it's got political, there's a lot of political weight on it, and they can't say actually it's not worked very well. But if you set it up right in the beginning, then you can measure and quickly change or stop if it's not being successful.
If a government allocates money, huge amount of money to a particular sector or system, and does not put in place data for measuring performance, that doesn't look like a good.
No, it doesn't.
That doesn't look.
And I think there's this tension today between natural impatience of politicians. We're going through a general election now, and we all want to get in and deliver our manifestos quickly as possible. You've actually got something to say to politicians. You need to think about how you're going to stage those changes, how you're going to actually deliver them. Because if you don't plan from the beginning, so take the Cancer Drugs Fund, quite a controversial issue because it hasn't delivered. What it was supposed to do was to test bed certain drugs, particularly for rare cancers, and see what was effective, and then look at whether there were ways of providing that more widely. They've never measured the outcomes for patients. So you could have been offered a rare drug through that at cost to the taxpayer, good perhaps for the patient, but there was no checking how long that patient lived for as a result of that investment. So there was no tracking done, and that's shocking that was set up to do that, and yet the measurements weren't put in place. And there are many examples like that. Now that's an example of an impatient Prime Minister promising something, and no one stopped probably to say to him, look, Prime Minister, if we wait a couple of years, we'll get this better done. It was all rushed through without those proper measures in place. And this is lots of taxpayers' money, billions of pounds going into these projects. So it's really important.
This is a cross-party committee.
Yes.
And this is a key finding of that committee, Public Affairs Committee. When you pass this to the government, did you see any desire in the government to put in place a system to measure performance?
We're getting better. It's getting better. So now every government department has to list all the projects that they're delivering, and we're increasingly asking them to collect data. If we make a recommendation as a committee, we have quite a lot of power. That government department has to respond to it. And if we don't like the response, something again I've introduced as chair is I call them back in and say, you gave us a bad answer to this. Why? What are you doing? We've had at least 3 overturned in committee. So I've said they've given us an answer we didn't like. We've called them back in, and in the middle of the committee room, they've acknowledged that they got it wrong the first time round. So we're saying to them, you've got to think hard about why you're saying no to our recommendations. We make them in a measured way. We make them realistic. We're not asking them to jump through bureaucratic hoops, because the focus of our work is how taxpayers' money is spent wisely and the impact on the citizen. So if you can get, that's why we're making those recommendations, because those 2 things matter. Because, my constituents, your viewers, they're paying their tax money for these services. They want a good service for that money, and they want it spent efficiently. And that's our job, to make sure we hold government's feet to the fire on that.
While doing this job and trying to get information, is it possible for you to ask a head of a government agency or department to say, we want to see you, and he or she says, I'm sorry, I'm not responsible to you, I'm responsible to the Prime Minister, and not
No, they have to come in front of us once we ask them.
What if they don't?
Well, I think theoretically I can lock them in a room in a tower in Parliament. I have once rung up somebody and said, I gather you're reluctant to come. We could summon you, but I'd rather you came by my polite invitation. And funnily enough, he chose to follow my polite invitation. Actually, it was the 4th invitation we'd issued, but he did come. And I did point out that I had this power to put him in a little room in a tower somewhere, but he didn't fancy that. So I've never had to use it. But it's really important you come, and you've got to tell the truth to the committee. And and we have the power to call them back too. So we don't do it willy-nilly. I mean, they're busy people. I want them to, but they need to be on the money and on the button about what they're there for, and we're there to remind them, the conscience really. You're there. This is not other people's money. This is taxpayers' money, hard-earned, hard, won, and they don't want to give it up. And you've got to spend it well, and you've got to think about the impact of your services on them. You can't just sit in Whitehall removed from the reality. And remember, I'm an MP, or when I have been an MP, I'm a candidate now. We see people all the time at surgeries, on their doorsteps, in their homes. We hear directly when things are going wrong. And my best resource is other MPs and people working very closely with people who can tell me when something's not working.
Sam, I mean, if you hear this, that, okay, government has put in X and X billions of pounds into a particular sector, but no data to measure performance. Because
yes,
probably they're having issues with project management or people to actually manage, execute the projects.
Yeah,
How does it sound?
I mean, it sounds typical. I mean,
Typical?
government. Yeah, I mean, government.
Typical of what?
Government systematically across the board has a problem with execution, and it has a problem with it doesn't subject itself. Nor is there any reason it necessarily should, but it doesn't in all areas. But it doesn't subject itself to the same sort of rigor that you subject yourself to if you're running a private business. So if you're given a budget of several £billion to complete a project, if you're looking at the HS2, for example, project, it's certain to overrun. And the reason it'll overrun is because there's had to be a parliamentary vote to get it through. It's cost a lot of political capital for the government to get the votes. Both of the major parties are committed to seeing HS2 completed. So it will happen. So it will happen when the budget doubles, which it will, because there are a lot of people there who for whom there is no success incentive. There's no incentive to get it done in the short term. You can just sit there and collect your money, basically. The other thing about government and its ability to execute, and this is the more understandable element of it, is that the government spends something in the region of £800 billion a year. That's an awful lot of money by anyone's standards, and I think there's an extent to which it's unrealistic to expect that money to be as effectively managed as it would be if it were smaller amounts of money being managed by companies, if you see what I mean. I mean, obviously with departments, it's broken down by departments, but some of those departments, the Department of Health, Education, DWP, the amounts of money that you're talking about having a relatively small number of people manage, they have they're basically, I work with a lot of startups, and with a startup they can turn on a dime, they can make a decision whenever they need to make a decision. With the government department, you're turning an oil tanker. If you want to see a policy change, you're turning something that is big and heavy and set in its ways.
Should that be an excuse?
Well, no, I think that I hear what you're saying, and of course some of these complex projects are very complex, but when you break it down, say the NHS budget, the individual trusts and GP practices and others, they're running their own budgets, so each bit needs to be responsible, just as you would be, at home. If you're how many people in the house, I'll say turn the heating down, or they're looking at their phone bills, and people are watching their pennies, and what we were trying to instill in government departments is that you need to look at that too. So who's responsible ultimately for making those tough decisions? And sometimes it is tough decisions, saying, well, we could carry on providing things as we are, or we could actually decide to trim back our spending. So my own borough of Hackney, because councils have been their funding has been slashed by something like 40% over the last 5 years or so, nearly 7 years now. So in Hackney, you'll find the streets are still swept, but in some areas they're not swept quite so frequently. They're swept frequently enough to make them stay clean, because they've made that decision that that's a way, for example, in that bit of the budget, they can save money. I know school teachers, I've been meeting them very intensely over the last few weeks. They are looking at ways they can try and save money without reducing the offer to children in the classroom. That's getting increasingly difficult in schools, but they are aware and sensible that they want to save as much money as possible to invest in pupils. So, not there are any luxuries left in British schools, I don't think, but they wouldn't be doing things that weren't really, really important. They will make choices, choose priorities, and that has to happen. So, but that said, we take those two areas. The demands for efficiencies from government, as they call it, are outstripping what's going to be possible, and that's the two big areas I've flagged up for the next Public Accounts Committee, which I hope to chair, but it's no guarantee, will be they need to look at very closely.
Well, if you look at public accounts and you see how much money is being cut from policing and education, does that raise any concern?
Yes, I mean, and policing is a real worry because, well, I mean, I've been a London MP, so we see there obviously the demands on counter-terrorism that come through the Met, but also the value in my constituency. There was the police were a byword for poor behaviour, and the relations between the police were very bad 25, 30 years ago. And we had neighbourhood police on the ground, talking to residents, getting to know them, became part of the streets, part of the community, exactly. And they've been withdrawn by and large, so we're really seen a real reduction in that. And that's soft intelligence, as people call it, getting to know people so that you don't see police officers only when the blue flashing light in the car drives up and some people get out and arrest somebody, which is all quite dramatic. It's just going with the grain of the community and listening to what's going on. And that is not soft stuff, actually. It's pretty important. People get to know their area, the intelligence and networks they create. And police have, we've had some very clear warnings from the head of the Met that they've cut very close to the bone now, and any further reductions will mean that there's got to be a reduction in service. Already we're seeing police around the country saying they won't investigate certain crimes, or they won't go around if there's a burglary, they won't go visit people after the event. They'll focus on the most vulnerable rather than you or me if we have an issue. And only today reports that people will self-report, put in their own witness statements, because we're not talking to police officers on certain issues.
Just this year alone, there has been about probably 10 to 12 deaths associated to knifing, and there has been an increase in number of crimes, knife-related crimes and deaths. Will that be as a result of policing cuts to policing budget? And is your committee, was that committee concerned? Look, especially in your constituency, I mean, Acne, other constituencies around down this area, where there has been that increase, that regular attack. Shouldn't that raise some red light?
Absolutely. And of course, it's more complex than just police numbers, because sadly, knives have become the weapon of the easy weapon, I suppose, for young people to carry, partly as protection in some cases. And I think we need a much deeper look further back down the line about what it is that makes young people afraid. And a lot of young people are living lives that people frankly in Parliament and Whitehall don't understand, where you're running the gauntlet when you go home about which gang you should be a member of, or which gang wants you to be a member of them. And the fear of the gangs and the crime is something that is really intense for young people. It's very palpable. The fear is as real for them as the reality, which is actually a very small percentage of people obviously involved in this in reality. So it's really important we get that. And I did a youth survey a few years ago. I was due to do another one, but the elections got in the way, and we'll hopefully do it afterwards, to ask young people their views about what works. And so, I've asked people about stop and search, for example. And some young people said, well, if I'm being stopped, at least I know the guy with the knife is being stopped. But, there's also a sensitivity about stop and search, about some people who end up getting targeted more, particularly, increasingly young Asian men, also young black men still. Obviously there's been a lot of changes in stop and search. So it's a complex mixture of things. One of the things that my borough and other London boroughs have done to quite good effect is to have what they call integrated gang units. Now, this isn't just about knife crime, but that's big overlap there, that helps get people out off the groove of potentially getting into the crime and carrying weapons to protect themselves. But we need to start younger, and I was delighted that my own 8-year-old had a lesson about this sort of thing in school from a police officer only in the last few weeks. We need to get young people to understand the reality that they need, and how to protect themselves. And it's complex, and if only we could solve it more easily. It's a tragedy. We had a very big event recently, a march against knife crime, and hearing every mother speak about her lost child just brings home to you the enduring tragedy. It's a life sentence for the families, and it's just got to stop. So more police would help. We need more to help young people who are on the path, beginning to get on the path to doing this, to get out of it. And we need to make sure that the young people who are good kids who don't want to get involved have options. So the right youth facilities to go to, housing, that is secure, a secure home, and parents are in work, because all of these things help them in their lives.
In your capacity as the MP, then your candidate now, what have you done to ensure that some of these ideas about helping deal with these crimes and put an end to this insane killing of young people, especially in the Black, Asian, Caribbean community.
Yeah, exactly. And it is particular communities that are more affected. I think it's really important to not be afraid to call out that difference. And so that is partly an understanding, is that are there any particular things that are going on in certain communities, or what is it that's affecting those young people? But one of the things is to make sure there's really good youth provision for those who need it, but understanding and listening to young people about what it is that how they feel about it. It is no good having a famous footballer, usually someone who's now retired, because they, coming along and saying, don't take up knives. That doesn't affect young people. Well, maybe it has an effect. I'm not knocking that everyone should say this. But the local heroes are the local boxing coach or the local football coach, or the wonderful Nicolette on the Morningside Estate in Hackney, who's run this fantastic youth group for years, and she does it for love. And she knows the young people in the area. They feel safe with her. It's a good, safe haven, and we need to make sure that all our young people have that. And after the riots in Hackney, we had some very interesting community conversations. People know the vulnerable people in their neighbourhood, but they don't know what to do with that information. If a child's regularly going home and there's difficulties in the home, maybe that their brother's in a gang, or they've had problems with other people on the estate with knives, they know there's a vulnerability there, but they don't know where to report it to. They don't want to put that person into trouble, but they know that young person needs help. And so people can identify it, and we need to give those neighbours help and support as well. And I think we haven't really got that cracked yet.
Quickly, before we go on this break, before we open the phone line for our viewers to call into the studio, let's get down a little bit to your constituency. Your constituency is one of the constituencies with the largest concentration of immigrants. Well, let me put it in England. And we have a government that is cutting down on immigration, that is determined to cut down on net migration. What are your concerns? How much of these affect members of your constituency?
Oh, I mean, my immigration caseload has got so much more complicated and more pernicious over the years. So, for instance, reducing discretionary leave to remain down from 5 years to 3 years, then 2.5 years, making people go through the hoops, spend the money, the complex bureaucracy around it, just making life as difficult as possible for people. We're not welcoming people who are often coming to work in our public services, contributing to Shoreditch Tech City, the tech hub on the edge of my constituency. These are all people who want to contribute, and we make it very difficult. So getting down to tens of thousands is almost impossible. Even if you take out European migration, we need people in all sorts of jobs. The figure may be a bit out of date, but a few years ago it was true that 1 in 10 Black African women in the UK was a nurse. So that's just one group of people that we need very desperately in this country, and it's going to take a long while to skill up other people to take those roles. We need that. We're a very young borough, but Britain as a whole is not young. We need young people to do jobs. Why is it that Scotland wants immigrants? Because they know they need young people to come in, and very often immigrants are often younger just because of the nature of people's migration movements. So I think it's a pernicious policy. Life is just made harder and more expensive for people. Barriers are put in the way, and ultimately, if someone's got leave to remain for 2.5 years, they're probably going to get it for 5. It would have been cheaper, easier all round to let them have it. And the other thing I'm really anxious about is, and I pushed this when I was a minister in the Home Office, when I finished that 7 years ago, was to try and get better legal support at the early stages, because some people are pushed around the system, get bad legal advice, and that just puts their cases back. And if they got good legal advice, they might be told you don't have a chance, but at least they'd know earlier on whether they had a chance of staying or not under the law. And at the moment, it's very, very difficult to get good legal advice unless you've got the money to pay for it. And of course, a lot of people haven't. If you're on a low wage, if you aren't able to work, you haven't got the money. And even if you are working, you've got permission to work. You're not always going to be in the best job and able to pay for expensive legal
Is
fees.
Brexit likely to compound this problem?
I don't think it's I think it does, because it sets the tone anti-immigrant. It sets the tone against, obviously, Europeans. I'm fighting a battle for European citizens who are living in my constituency and in Britain to get status and get that agreed quickly. But even if you stop European migration, you're not going to hit this tens of thousands aspiration that the government's got, which is crazy that they're still pursuing it, because it's just not possible. But it appeals to people at election time, so they keep repeating it, even though they have manifestly failed to get anywhere near that figure. And we need to be really honest about the fact that we need people with skills that we haven't got in the UK. And even if you skill people up in the UK over time, we still need those people, and we shouldn't be kicking them out when we don't need them. I think we need to have a much clearer, fairer, transparent policy, and not one that is so over-bureaucratic and costly that it's just saying to people, well, you can come here, but we're going to make it as difficult as possible for you to stay. You know, we have clear parameters. If you meet those criteria, then you should be allowed to stay.
In the manifesto released by Labour, Jeremy Corbyn will not commit himself to setting or meeting any migration target. He has insisted on a single market, and one of the conditions the EU has set for single market is open border. How would that work? What are the chances of that working with Britain, working with the people? How do you think they will accept that?
Well, I think there's a big challenge. I would love us to, I think it is for all sorts of reasons. British businesses do a lot of business with Europe. We do need to really work hard to see if we can keep that relationship going. It's going to be very difficult. It depends how the election goes. Even then, it's 27 European countries deciding effectively for us how we will work with them. But, I mean, our approach to immigration in the Labour Party is it's about setting clear rules. And if there are needs for certain types of jobs, then we should be saying, well, we want to welcome people to those roles. One of the things I really would like us to see do, though, is clear the backlog and make life not, you know, just if you're qualified to stay, then do your 5 years and then you can get citizenship, not this constantly reapplying, which is so time-consuming. And I meet so many people who fall foul of the rules by a day or two, and then they're suddenly in breach of immigration conditions, and it's all a part of a government plan to make that, well, then they count as a statistic to deport. But actually, very often they don't get deported because there's very good reasons for them to stay. There's just a long and expensive legal process, a bureaucratic process to get them back to where they were before, and it just seems to me costly, wasteful, and not very welcoming.
Samit Wamini, when you hear some of these policies about government cutting down immigration, no, we want to get out of the EU, we don't care whether we get a single market, the market is open to everybody, we can go global. You're a businessman running a multi-faceted organization. What normally comes to your mind when you hear some of this?
Well, I don't do any business with Europe, so it doesn't bother me particularly at all.
So you
the
do
fall
business
in
with Africa?
The fall in the pound that's come as a result of Brexit's actually been very good for our business. So to that extent, it's all right for us. But I know a lot of people who do business with Europe, and I know a lot of people I know a lot of European migrants who have come here who are worried about their status, as you say, and that's obviously a problem. Though I do understand why the government aren't prepared to move on that while the European Union are being similarly intransigent about British citizens who are in Europe and their rights. But I think the key thing is this tens of thousands figure is if it's not unachievable, it is certainly an aspiration that is set so far away that it will not be achieved in the next Parliament, and I don't think we'll get close to it in the next Parliament.
Well, 7 years and there's no progress on it.
Yeah, although there may be some difference that comes as a result of leaving the European Union. I don't really know. I'm quite in favour of the type of I'm not in favour of Brexit, but having voted to leave the European Union, I don't mind the idea of a fairer immigration system. It doesn't really make sense to me that someone should be able to come into this country with no skills from Eastern Europe, whereas someone who has maybe no skills but good reasons to want to come to Britain, maybe they've got a spouse or they've got relatives in the country and they're coming from Nigeria, for example, that person should be treated with a priority as far as I'm concerned, ahead of someone who has no pre-existing or existing relationship with Britain coming from Eastern Europe to take close.
So if you put them on side by side, the policies of the Conservative Party and the policies of the Labour Party just released on their manifesto as to immigration, which one would you say is best for Britain?
On immigration specifically?
Specifically.
Best for Britain in what sense? It's a very broad question. I think...
In the sense of...
I think that...
The Conservative Party and the government said we want to cut down on immigration,
I think
reduce
the Labour Party's
migration.
The Labour Party's policy of not seeking to reduce migration and seeking to establish a fair system of migration after Brexit is the most... is the better policy for Britain economically. I think that much is almost certain. I don't think, in the light of the Brexit vote, that the Brexit vote, to my mind, demonstrated that there is a deep sense of unease with the level of migration that has happened in this country, and I think that for politicians of any sort to not respond to that political reality is a significant mistake. So I think
when I was a minister in the Home Office, we were looking at areas where it actually was mostly about European migrants, where you'd have, for example, fruit pickers turn up in a town, schools population would change dramatically, and you suddenly have another language spoken in a school that previously hadn't had that language spoken from, say, Slovakia or Romania or somewhere, and they just couldn't cope with the sudden change. We were sort of setting up a fund so that, for instance, the head teacher or the GP's practice could find translation services, information, and it wouldn't be very much money, but just help people absorb that. Because we're a very welcoming country on the whole. When I dealt with people being resettled for UN camps, there were cities and towns in Britain that really worked with the team that did the resettlement to welcome people from certain parts of the world and develop knowledge and skills about the country of origin and really made very warm welcome. But when you look, it's quite shameful really. We talk a lot about refugees and migrants, and the people who are visible get the attention. But I think of Sierra Leone, and having gone through the war, Ebola, and I have many Sierra Leone constituents who've got orphaned family members in Sierra Leone who have no ability to come to the UK. Now, we don't want to lose Sierra Leone's all their talented young people, but actually we should be getting to a mature status where we know that there is movement across the world. And if somebody who's an orphaned teenager in Sierra Leone could live with their family here, and hope, it might just be temporary so that they go back, but they get that family support. As a mother, I wouldn't want my 13 or 14-year-old to be left alone after all that they've been through, having lost parents in that sort of difficult situation. So we don't quite get it right, I think, a lot of the time. And it's very difficult to have a rational conversation because there's such heat around this.
Yeah, before we go on this show, let me quickly put this to you. When we put this program on our Facebook page, we had loads of interest, more specifically on your intervention in people in your constituency, your constituents, how you stood in for them, how you helped them deal with a couple of issues around immigration and around a couple of other challenges around your constituencies. This is a question. I'm going to read a couple of some of these comments about you have for our viewers to see. But how do you feel when you go out there and your constituents, they look at you and say, oh, this is an angel, this is a hero, she's done very well for us? How do you feel, especially the black, your constituents, immigration?
Well, I always feel very welcomed, and I'm always delighted when someone says hello to me in the street, because it's really good to get feedback. But you always feel you do so little. I mean, politics is a team game, so anything I do is usually a result of other people's work as well. The key thing is to learn from those individual experiences and see how I can use Hackney's experience to shape what government does. So one of the things I've got planned, again, the election got in the way, was to tell individual stories about people in Hackney, so including people who've been waiting for their immigration status, who've been going through a slow bureaucratic procedure when really it was pretty clear what's going to happen in the end. They will be granted status, and to say what that does to their lives, how it upheaves them. So I have a job to listen to people, and it's a pleasure, always a pleasure, to be in people's homes or at surgeries hearing what they've got to tell me. Not many people now visit people at home. Health visitors do, midwives do, I do. I suppose the vicar does, or the pastor at times of crisis. But it's a privilege because people will share things with me that they wouldn't always share with everybody else. And I feel a great weight of responsibility then to do something useful with that and to help that use their experience, be their voice, to change the way the system works. So the Public Accounts Committee gives me a great opportunity to do that. If there's something going wrong with the DWP or the immigration system, there are times I have that opportunity to put it very directly to the people in charge of the system. But without the people of Hackney, I would be nowhere. I can't do it on my own, and they are a fantastic help and resource and a great support.
All right, we're going to a very short break. We'd like to go on a very short break now. When we come back, hopefully, we will open the studio line. You might be able to call in and share your experience with us on some of these issues we have raised on the show today. Let's go on a short break. We'll be back. Don't go away.
Man is what we're going to hear on Newspunch. We'll give you the information that you need, from business to economy to politics to technology. And that's all we do here on Newspunch, from the beginning to the end. And that is why we are there. Keep watching Newspunch from Ben Television. And today I'll be your host. From politics to economy, business, technology, the totality of what makes man is what we bring to you here on Newspunch. We give you the information that you need, from business to economy to politics to technology. And that's all we do here on Newspunch, from the beginning to the end. And that is why we are here. Keep watching Newspunch from Ben Television. And today, I'll be your host.
All right, welcome back and thank you for joining us. I think the phone line is going to be open now. You can join us. I'm joined in the studio today by Meg Ilia, who is the Labour and Co-Parliamentary candidate for Hackney South and Shoreditch. So she's still standing and you're free to call into the studio, share your experience with us. Quickly, before we take calls, let me ask a question about your role in the Speaker's Commission on Digital Democracy. Some of the key targets and recommendations made by that commission include that by 2020 there should be secure online voting option for all voters. How do you think that's going to work?
Well, we did know it was a challenge. When we set that, we decided to set a stiff target.
That's just about 3 years away.
Well, I think now with the change of election dates, we may be looking at revisiting that. Something I wanted to discuss with my fellow commissioners, because although the commission doesn't exist exactly anymore, we do meet as commissioners to talk about progress. We were really throwing the gauntlet out there, saying that if increasingly we bank online, we shop online, we do a lot of secure transactions online. It does seem very old-fashioned that when you vote, it's a piece of paper and a pencil. Postal voting is the only modernisation really that there's been. But we are aware that it needs to be very secure, and that is the biggest challenge. And recent hacking experiences demonstrate how much of a challenge that is and why it's important to do it while maintaining the confidence of the public. So it's still very much work in progress, and not something that Parliament alone can do, of course. It's got to be, well, organisations like those that Sam works with that will be coming up with solutions. And opinions are very divided on how possible this is. So we knew we were setting a stiff challenge, and we've still got some way to go today. Be interested to know what people think about it.
Sam, how do you think that's going to work? This age where it's easy for anybody to hack into any system. We're still talking about Russia's influence in the last US election.
The hacking thing is obviously a big deal, you know, and you've got to depend on your IT systems being updated. It's absolutely shocking to me to discover that an enormous percentage of NHS computers are running Windows XP, which came out before I finished school. So it's
only moments ago then.
Yeah. So it's very surprising, and so you need to be very robust about how you're doing this, especially if it's how you're making the decisions that you're making. But I have sort of two broader things that I assume you've that have been considered as commissioners. But one of the things that strikes me about the potential with digital voting, if I can vote from the comfort of my own home, is there not a risk that within particularly within family units, there's potential for votes to be coerced? Would be my first thought on it, and my second, so because you can get everyone around the computer together, and you each go up and you're all watching each other's screens. The other thing I'd say is that yes, it is remarkably old-fashioned. That so I voted in a local election last week or the week before, whenever those were. It is remarkably old-fashioned that walk round to the local church and turn up and get a paper ballot and use a little pencil to tick a box. But it is not. It's not a broken system as far as I can tell. I mean, ignoring what complaints people might have about the way that we vote and proportional representation and arguments of that sort, but the physical way that we vote is old-fashioned, but it seems sort of okay.
Well, except actually it's not incredibly secure. There isn't a great deal of evidence. There's a lot of impersonation, but we don't have to prove who we are when we vote. Registration online is more complicated, but in terms of people voting at home and voting together, you could do that with postal votes. People could see votes. So we're already, once you start taking it out of the polling station, you build in potential insecurities. Now, the question is, when I bank online, I now have to go through various checks and readers and stuff. There are ways of doing those things secure enough for me to be sure that it's going to be okay, and I think that's the challenge, to get it to that point. The difficulty is, of course, with other things like whether you have a subscription to Netflix or you bank online, you can do it from anywhere. I can do that from anywhere in the world. When you vote, you have to vote in the area in which you live. And we've been talking to the BBC actually about how they do that with licence fee, because at the moment that's where you live, but increasingly people move around, how they make sure those sorts of things are portable. So technology is moving on, but you know, I was responsible for identity cards in the last government. The technology was probably out of date when I took over that project. These days everyone uses a fingerprint. I get into my computer now with a fingerprint. There are ways of doing this.
Well, there's no necessary reason.
Because my time, I'd like to move away from that quickly.
But anyway, work in progress by a long way.
Work in progress.
Not much progress.
Interesting stuff.
If that happens, hopefully the government will be able to put enough money into securing the server and ensure that there's no intervention from the third party. Quickly, let's talk about the selection.
Well,
chances of a Labour government?
Well, Labour has a mathematical challenge. A lot of elections is about the maths. Yeah, it's about the maths, isn't it? Because in the end, it's not just about how many people vote overall, it's how many people vote in individual constituencies. Yeah. So in London, for instance, my party is defending a number of what we call micro-marginals, with people with fewer than 1,000 votes. Now, you know, those seats are, you know, so you can have lots more votes, but if they're not in those seats, then we won't get a government. So it's quite a big challenge, and we've seen, for instance, in the West Midlands, a Conservative mayor elected there, which is a bit of a blow to us. It doesn't mean we can't win in the general election, but it's a sign that things are not looking particularly good our way, and we'll see what happens. I think there's 28 out of 32 Labour of the MPs for the city for the West Midlands are currently Labour, so that, you know, that's not going so well. I think that there is an interesting difference of opinion. Brexit seems to cut across party lines. So I'm meeting people who had party allegiances who are voting for candidates who represent their views on Europe more. So there are Conservatives who are voting for Labour MPs or Labour candidates. There are Labour candidates who are not wanting to vote for Labour MPs, and Labour voters not wanting to vote for their candidate because of that view as well. So I think there's a real, I think it's a very much of a campaign very much in flux. People are breaking away from old party loyalties in many cases. Though I have to say, when I've been canvassing, people who are solidly supporting the Labour Party, on the whole, are sticking with the Labour Party in London, that was my experience. But I'm only a candidate, so I'm never the best person to ask about the big picture. Sam may have more time than me to look at those wider issues.
Before I come to you, Sam, what is the biggest challenge facing Labour today? No, Mike.
For you.
For me, I think it's showing that we're a party that's ready for government, and this snap election hasn't helped because it's very difficult. An opposition in 2 years does not really have a fully worked up set of policies. So we've got some good policies there, but the key thing is about prioritising those policies. In our manifesto, there's a lot of things, not all achievable within 5 years. So the question will be, if we get into power on June the 9th, what will we, we'll be able to see the government books in great detail. There will have to be quick decisions made about which are the most important things to pursue quickly. So, for example, we've already put off rail nationalisation into the future, waiting to do it the cheapest and most efficient way, which is to wait till the franchises run out. So that's already knocked off to really basically beyond the next election. And there will be other issues as well. So money for schools, I would say, would be a higher priority, reversing those cuts. Money for the NHS. Actually, you know, not just short-term, we've got to have a long-term plan for that. So that's a bit of a mix of immediate action, but also a proper long-term plan. So that's the key challenge now, is how we then prioritise the many promises that we've made.
Sam, biggest challenge for Labour?
Well, I mean, the voters are really the biggest challenge for the Labour Party at the moment.
How do you mean? And for any party,
well,
the voters, it's not only
general
Labour.
election, it's
well,
voters
the
cards,
don't seem to be an enormous challenge for the Tories at the moment. I mean,
what makes you think so? In
the polling, the local election results. I mean, the thing about
the local election results were in the shires. Remember, they were in areas where the Conservatives are generally
the
stronger.
swing, though, is what I'm interested in.
Can the poll be wrong? It was wrong during the
yeah,
referendum. It was wrong.
You put this to me every time that I've said
it was wrong during the US election.
Yeah. The answer
and
is
don't forget that government
is
changing across the world today.
Sure. But in the Brexit referendum, it was wrong within the margin of error. In the Trump election, it was wrong, but it was within the margin of error. If this is as wrong as the Trump result, then Labour will only have the Conservatives will only have a 50-seat majority rather than a 100-seat majority, which is what they have if the polls are right. That's where the electorate is, and it's for a number of reasons. And I think the most glaring one, from my perspective, and you're right, Brexit has cut across party lines. The Labour Party does not have a sufficiently clear position on Brexit.
Is that right?
Well, I think that, I mean, I have a different view to my national party on this, because I feel that we were too quick to accept, not that we lost the referendum. I accept that we lost the referendum, but we gave the government a blank cheque about how to negotiate in Europe, and we needed a stronger position then. So I voted to not trigger Article 50 for that reason alone. And I think we need to be very clear. I think we are now clear. I think Keir Starmer has laid out, access to the single market is a really key priority.
I'm afraid I need to go now because of our time. It's been a great pleasure. With the way it was going, we could have some more time to keep talking about this. Thanks a lot for joining us, Meg. Thanks for coming on the program today. Thanks for joining us. We wish you the best of luck. Hopefully, you're going to come back next time as MP.
I look forward to seeing you again.
All right.
Whether I'm the MP or not, you're happy.
Sam,
yeah.
Thanks as usual.
Always a pleasure.
My name is Tunde Alabi. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us on the program. Thank you for watching. We see you again. Have the best of evening. Bye.
A general election to be held on the 8th of June.
For the people of Britain to stand up against this government and its failed economic agenda, which has left our NHS in problems, which has left our schools underfunded.
I don't think it's undemocratic for us to say the British people should have the final say on that deal. Now, if they like that deal, then yes, we leave on those terms.
This is now a general election. I think that politics is on our table. We're the only party that has campaigned all our political lives to offer real Brexit.
If you feel cheated by the current system, it's time to change the game. Together, we can change the game.